Well, I've been taking the last couple weeks to talk about some values of who we will and want to be as a church. And so one of the things I've been saying over the past year is we want to be a loving church, of course. Love is the center stone, the cornerstone, the beginning, the middle, the end of Christian faith. So we want to be a loving church. We want to be a feeling church, and one of the things I've been saying is we want to be a thinking church. And so what happened, what's really happened in the 20th century is Western Christianity saw a lot of huge growth. Churches grew, denominations grew. When you look at post-Civil War, most Christian colleges were invented anywhere from 1880 to 1920. Christian missionary organizations grew. Western Christianity saw a great flux, especially Protestant Christianity in the West. Now, what was also happening at the time is there was a reaction to the Enlightenment. Post-war, not only was faith growing in the West, but so were theologies, biology, physics, the sciences, medical science, social science, anthropological science, archaeological science, psychological science. All of these things as well were growing in the 20th century. But as much of the growth as we saw in the 20th century, something changed at the millennium. Something changed as we started this century. So even though we could point to lots of church growth, like on the surface of a ship, you go, wow, there's a lot of people out on the deck under the surface. Sort of like the Titanic illustration. Lots of partying and violin playing and celebrating and lots of enjoyment and glee happening on the deck. Great meaning, great experiences. What was happening below at the turn of the millennium, part of the ship is taking on lots of water. And so as we turned in the millennium, what also happened in the West, especially in Europe, the second half of the 20th century, church attendance started to go down. As we see it happening in the new millennium, that is now spread across the great ocean, and it's happening here. And so though maybe your experience is one of meeting and buoyancy, which I hope it is, wise people also look at what's happening. Now, when they do polls and do studies as to why it is happening, why more and more people, especially generations younger than maybe you, are leaving in droves, there's a number of reasons, but one of the reasons has to do with this, the mind. It has to do with wisdom. So we hit the third millennium, and this faith that we are devoted to, absolutely. These creeds we hold, gosh, I hope so, then it's not measuring or mapping or relating to the wisdom of real life. And then when people are given just certain doctrinal answers, or listen, save the questions, man, just believe. Wise people don't go, okay. Wise people go, whoa, wait a minute here. And so as Christianity begins its third millennium, if Christianity is what it says it is, which the New Testament talks about, one of the cornerstones of Christianity is wisdom. Look at this passage from James. But the wisdom from above is first of all pure. It is also peace-loving, gentle at times, and willing to yield to others. It is full of mercy. What is wisdom? Full of mercy and the fruit of good deeds. What is wisdom? It shows no favoritism. What is wisdom? It's always sincere. And those who are peacemakers, what is wisdom? They are peacemakers, will plant the seeds of peace and reach a harvest of righteousness. So if Christianity is what it is, and Jesus teaching in chapter 1, that one of the cornerstones of his teaching is wisdom, if our Christian faith finds its roots in our Jewish heritage. And if you read the Old Testament, one of the cornerstones of the Old Testament, the validity of a spiritual life is wisdom. Look what this says in Proverbs 4. Do not forsake wisdom, and she will protect you. Love her, she will watch over you. The beginning of wisdom is this: get wisdom, though it will cost all that you have. Get understanding. A great scholar and one who considers himself a Christian believer, Alan Jacobs, from Baylor University, just wrote a great small book. In fact, I want to show you it here. If you want a book on this, it's called How to Think. And he writes this book. It just came out this month. It is a great read. And it's basically, listen, as faith-believing people, we have to think. And so Jesus' prize teaching on the Wednesday of Holy Week is to love the Lord God with all your heart. So love God with your mind. And so what some of us do feel, as much as we love our faith, as much as we want to stay devoted to it, we've got to be a thinking faith. Why? Because from our Jewish roots and to our Christian beginnings, wisdom, loving God with our mind, is prized. What Jacobs mentions, and it's not a spoiler, he says it in the introduction. What's the problem with thinking and why most people don't? Is because it's hard. Wouldn't it be real easy for me to go, listen, for the next 30 minutes, you do not have to think. I will tell you what to do. I will tell you what to believe. Whatever cloud and haze you are in, I have an answer for, because I know would this not work? It works in churches all over America. But is this the kind of church and teaching that Jesus wants? And should it not matter that though we're enjoying ourselves on the deck of the ship and having a great experience, that there is a big hole in the side? And one of the reasons our children and grandchildren will leave is because they go, I cannot be part of a faith that doesn't love God with all its mind. And so that matters to me. So last week I talked about two of these values, that faith is not belief, faith is trust. And I showed you this story of when Jesus encounters the Samaritan woman. I also said that faith begins, as Jesus said, it will be a well, a spring of water that mounts up where? Within you. So this idea of actually being true to yourself within you is being true to God. And so today I want to talk a little bit about wisdom and why this is important to us. Now, what is wisdom? There's a number of answers, but it certainly is the combination of knowledge. So wisdom is knowing things. But then that doesn't just suffice, because we all know the person that was really good at test taking, the person that was a brainiac in school in knowing things, or was really good with something, but then in common sense or relationships, you go, wow, that person can't navigate themselves out of a bag. So wisdom is the combination of knowing things, absolutely. The more you know, the more wise you have a chance of being. But it also is dependent on experience, but it means this. It's being able to then apply it correctly. Because you may know something and go, that's the right application, but your experience comes in and you go, well, that doesn't work. Or, here's what you know, here's what you need to apply, but all three of these situations are different, and you have different answers for every one of those. There was a thorough German study just done on wisdom. And by the way, neuroscience is starting to measure wisdom. There are different parts of your brain that you light up when you're using your wisdom versus just knowing stuff. So there is science behind this. But a number of years, a thorough study in Germany took place, and what they basically did was they got a controlled group of German journalists. And they said, we want you to come up with names of people that you think are wise. By the way, if I were to say, do you know somebody that is wise? Do you consider yourself a wise person? So they came up with names, and they were academics and scholars. They were philosophers and poets and company heads. They were theologians. They were cultural icons that they just go, this is who wisdom is. So they came up with this group. Then they came up with another controlled group that they said, this group of people is successful, but we don't necessarily think of these specific people as wise. But on that successful list were doctors, lawyers, company heads, other people, maybe academics as well. And then they started posing open-ended questions to all of this. Let's say there's an aged widow who has to make a choice between keeping her business alive or providing and being there for her daughter and grandchild. What should you do? And then they had answers. Say a severely depressed friend came up to you and in their depression and was seeking your advice. What would you say? And they came up with all of these questions and all of these answers. And so what the study showed, that there were 6 aspects of wisdom, which I want you to see here. One was positive attitudes, behaviors that create social acceptance. This means you can navigate your life in a way with your attitude and behaviors that brings not only social acceptability, brings people to you. You can navigate relationships. You can deal with things. Then there's social decision-making and practical knowledge. This is sort of this. This is, yes, it is knowing stuff. So the more you know, absolutely, you have a greater shot at wisdom. But wisdom is not just knowing something. It's actually experiencing something. But it's not just experiencing something. It's being able to take the two and apply it to something that makes sense. Then it's emotional awareness and emotional regulation. This isn't emotionalism. This isn't just having feelings. This is people who are very in touch and aware of their emotions. They can feel it and be honest to it, as well as they know how to regulate it when buttons get pushed or things get ignited or situations get frustrating or happy. And so what I'm really excited about now, how theology is starting to hold on to this science. Jesus talks about feelings certainly and demonstrates them. But as I spoke about last week, what has happened in our Western truth-telling Christianity, it was that your feelings and your body are bad. So it led us all to abandon our feelings. Our feelings lie to us. Where is that in the scriptures? I realize it's in certain religious teaching, but where is that in the scriptures? So people who are wise have emotional awareness, and they can regulate their emotions. Then there's reflection and self-understanding. Again, this is what I was teaching about last week when Jesus getting to the truth of who this woman is. If you believe you're bad, if you believe you're awful, if that's what it is, why would you ever reflect or go near that? If every time you go near that, the whole point is to mire in your awfulness, wouldn't you stay away from that? So this is why Christianity, with good intentions at times, has led to a lot of self-abandonment. But people who are very reflective and self-understanding and self-aware. Lionel just gave us a devotional on humility. The only way you can move and grow in that is through deep, deep self-reflection. And then tolerance value or appreciation value that can relate. What does this mean? This means there's a whole world out there that is different than you. And if you judge that world's different than you, or if you think that greater group is in their difference, you have scarcity towards them or build walls, that creates one thing, but a wise life is someone who goes, listen, I can navigate a world where many people are different than me, and I can appreciate them and appreciate and even learn about those differences. That leads to wisdom. Acknowledgement of and dealing effectively with uncertainty. I stood up here a year ago on Easter Sunday and said, listen, sometimes our faith has accidentally sold us all something. What is that? Certainty. And what the irony is, the more we take this book and give you certainty, the less certain you feel. But the more we go, life is uncertain, life is ambiguous, and yet I can still have a faith, a trust in God in that ambiguity. Life can be about asking more questions than giving certain answers. People that can live there, they're much wiser. Pastors who ask much more questions and allow their congregations to ask more questions than give answers, this is my take, you don't have to agree, I think you end up with a much wiser congregation. Why? Because that's how life goes, let's be honest. And so you read the scriptures and see if this is against them or no, makes sense. Does to me. And as I often say, you don't have to agree with me. So I want to just mention some things briefly in the time we have left here for the few minutes and talk about Jesus' quick encounter with this woman and talk a little about wisdom. Now remember, these two were foreign to each other. Samaritans and Jews sort of believed the same, but they had some major black and white differences. Samaritans, Jews sort of shared the same lineage and legacy, but post the exile, there were some black and white differences. Men and women in that culture, black and white differences in roles and expectations and values. Race, Judaism, and being a Samaritan, maybe shared huge scarcity issues. I don't like you. Why? Because you're different than me. I don't like you. Why? Because I'm part of the pure gang and you're part of the impure gang. So a lot is going on when Jesus walks through Samaria and sits down with this woman. And just what seems like a simple encounter, hey, do you mind dipping into the well and getting me a drink? And this is Jesus when he has one of his most famous teachings. Why would you ask me for drink? And he says to her, if you knew who I was, the water I could give you, you'll never be thirsty again. Now, does he mean physical thirst? No, he means her soul. He means her faith. He means her life. He means her mind. And so goes on this encounter, and I want you to see this in verse 10, as I just sort of cited it. If you only knew the gift God has for you and who is speaking to you, you would ask me, and I would give you living water. Let me just say this about wisdom that I see in this verse. Folks, wisdom can begin any time. And I know the scriptures teach, and life kind of teaches this general quotient that with gray hair, so to speak, with age and experience comes wisdom. Generally, we know that to be true. That's an okay to go, I agree with that mantra, and yet we all have a but to it. I know plenty of young people who are wise. I know plenty of people who have lots of age and gray hair and experience and know a lot and have experienced a lot. But they aren't able to combine this. And so what Jesus turns to this girl is saying, listen, you growing in wisdom, that can happen anytime. We all should be pursuers. If we are going to pursue our spiritual life, it is not about being mindfully deadened and just hooking you through and going, believe this. It's okay to ask questions about your faith. It's okay to figure out whether this works. It's okay to test your experience in what someone tells you is true. It's okay to figure this out. And any faith that is afraid of that, I'm not sure about the backbone of that faith. And so Jesus has a conversation with this person about black and white issues, and it goes differently. So wisdom can begin anytime, you know what I've appreciated, what we do in our home, and my wife has really led this, but as our kids are and have grown up, we talk about these things all the time. You say, David, you're the pastor. Did you do a family devotion and teach your kids the scriptures? And not in our home. That's not how we taught the scriptures. We taught life. We taught life. And so my kids love God. They love the scriptures. They love their trust in Jesus. But they didn't approach it by knowing something. We let them ask questions and still ask questions. And so my kids tend to run from the kind of faith that tells them what to believe. They tend to run towards a faith that has their trust in God. I want them, I've often said this, and I'll say it again. I do not want for my children happiness. That's not what I want. Yes, God, what do you want more? I just want them to be happy. I don't want that for my kids. Because you can't pursue happiness and get it. I want for my kids, for them to be wise. Think of that list. I want them to be wise. Then what is the fruit of a wise life? Seems like it would be contentment. So we did a lot of navigating, knowing things, and go, does that measure up with experience? Knowing this, someone says this is true, but if I apply that truth to this experience, does it work in all these situations? No. Yes here, no there. And so Jesus, I think, is moving this woman in that. Let me show you another one here in 21 through 24. Look at this. Jesus replied, "Believe me, dear woman, the time is coming when it will no longer matter whether you worship the Father in this mountain or Jerusalem, but a time is coming." I love how even Jesus catches himself. Listen, a time is coming. Scratch that. No, it's here. When true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. The Father is looking for those who will worship him in that way. And we looked at that word truth. Aletheia, and that word pneuma in spirit, which in this context means coming from within her. For God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship him how? Within their own spirit, from their own truth. And so he shows that and speaks to her that. So wise people see the world in shades of gray. In fact, he deals with her. Listen, you Samaritans have a black and white issue about worship. What? You worship God in Gerizim. The Jews have a black and white version of where to worship. Where? Jerusalem. Which is it? Which is it? Which is the right way? If it's black, or which is it? He goes, it's neither. It comes here. And so wise people are able to see a world in gray and able to navigate that. I told a group of people this story. I'll tell it again. When I was a young pastor, and Liz, we were newly married, and I started in my 20s as a campus pastor, both Liz and I. But when I left my 20s, in my 30s, I moved to church ministry. And I got a job, and then eventually Liz got a job. We got a job at that time, the largest church in the country. A very famous church, pastored by a very famous pastor. And we were one of the staff pastors. I was in my 30s. I was one of the line lieutenant pastors. And when you were hired there, it was a matrix kind of hired. There were 300 people on staff. So there was a head of HR, but you reported to this pastor for this kind of work. You reported to this director or pastor for another kind. So you were hired by about 5 people. But when I went through the HR department, the guy who led the HR department was the son of a very famous Christian. And when I met this guy, he did in my ministry, he did all of this personality testing to figure out, David, your gifting and your personality to be able to use right in our church. So there were several psychological tests and several gifting tests, and it was just amazing. And I sit down with them, and I remember Liz was there too. For the first time in my decade-old ministry, I go, I have met someone who gets me. You get me. Isn't it wonderful when you go, somebody gets me? And I love this guy. And so he was hired David Perez. So I loved him, and I would see him, hey. And we weren't best friends, but he meant something to me. Liz, though, did become friends with his wife. In fact, if you ever come to my house and we cook you tortilla soup, our killer recipe that you would pay for, because it's so good, is hers. And in my little cookbook, I give credit to her. So we loved him, and Liz loved her. One day after a couple years, we walked into church on a Monday or Tuesday morning, the beginning of the week, and there was an emergency staff meeting. All the staff, all 300 staff, need to be down in the chapel for an emergency meeting. And it was just one of those things that came over the phones and over your email. You go, this is not going to be good. So we get there, and I walk in with everybody else, and all the elders are sitting on the stage. And there's the lead pastor, who I love, who was the first pastor I was ever under. He's up there. And there in the front row of the chapel is my friend who had hired me, with his wife sitting next to him like this. And I go, felt like a funeral. And so the pastor gets up very gently, not with authority or bombasticness, talks about his love for this person, but says this person has made some choices that have disqualified them in ministry, and they laid those out for us. As this person just sat there in a pile, as his wife just sat there in a pile, they suddenly just became very small. And our pastor talked about Matthew 18, how the word says, listen, I hate to do this, but this is what the Bible says. The Bible says this about church discipline. And he read us the verse that if you're in pastoral ministry, you're familiar with, Matthew 18, around 17 through 20-something, about if your brother or sister sins, you go to them. You go, hey, look, man, knock it off. If they tell you to go jump in the lake, you go, I'll be right back, and you go get a buddy. Hey, you and your buddy go up to them and say, hey, you're missing this. He tells you to jump in the lake and go, yourself, and you go, okay, I'll be right back. Then you go get the church. And you go, listen, all of us are telling you to knock this off. And if he tells you to still jump in the lake, you kick him out of the fellowship. So our pastor is saying, because we love this person, this is what the Bible tells us to do. And so this person's stuff is aired in front of all of us. And we need to tell the truth in love as it was told to us. And this person just crushes and crushes and crushes. Everything in my spirit was going, no. Folks, what have we learned over the last 30, 40, 50 years? We've learned when people experience psychologically, sociologically, relationally, in community, this deep kind of shame, does it change them? Does it turn them? No, it devastates them. It devastates their mind, their heart, their soul. It devastates their trust. It makes God a dangerous, safe God, unsafe God. And what happened as a result of this tough love, he left our staff. Eventually his marriage fell apart. The addictions they were talking about, he moved to a pretty tough, seedy part of town where he was just entrenched in this little apartment in his addictions. And we all walked away and said, well, he just kind of refused the truth. Folks, we have to think. In fact, I hardly know any churches, wise churches, that practice that kind of church discipline. Why? Because we've learned so much. And so what we do, and I'll talk about this in the future. We look at the scriptures in the evolving story, which is to love people, restore people, at times confront people. But like this, because this is what it says in 4 verses in Matthew, think. We are sense makers. And we go, we can never destroy a person like that. And when they're destroyed like that, we walk away and go, thinking we're wise, going, well, they just rejected the truth. How does anybody recover from that? And I saw it happen 2 more times in my time there. And none of those people ever recovered. All right, I'll share these points, but I won't teach on them. I have more here, but let me show you what else wise people do. Number 3, they aim to understand rather than judge. I already spoke on that. Jesus is with this woman, and he gets into her soul. He talks about her life and her husband's, and he says, you know this truth. Everything in that verse says this woman felt completely and utterly safe. She's in a private conversation. When the other apostles come to include themselves, Jesus keeps that part of her life private. But wise people always wise Christians aim to understand. I tell my staff this, I teach my children this. Never conclude anything. You arrive at something. And so what happens is, just because somebody has a conviction doesn't mean they have wisdom. This is what I believe, man. This is what I believe it says you need to do. Don't ever conclude anything. This is why, and I'm not picking political sides, but go with me on this point. This is why I love the kids yesterday. They are asking questions. They are challenging my generation. They are saying, penetrate something deeper. But when we just go, well, this is what I believe about that, or this is what I believe about that, that's fine. You have convictions. You have beliefs. I'm not challenging that. You can have them. What I am saying, how did you get there? Did you just conclude them? Or have you arrived there? How do I arrive there? By full understanding. And so in this German study, what they did is they posed these questions. What about an aged widow who goes through this? What about a depressed friend? What do you tell a person? And people that gave, this is what I would tell them, they rated low on wisdom. One of the situations was marrying young. You have a teenager who comes to you and wants to get married young. Now, I have personal feelings and biases about that. Of course, I got married at 31 years old. So my life is absolutely. But what they showed in this study, and forget it's about a youth getting married, what they showed is the people that said it's terrible to get married young, it's wrong to get married young, and maybe in some cases it is, but they rated low in wisdom. Someone goes, well, let's take a step back. What is their value system? What kind of culture were they raised in? How mature is this person? So the issue is not the issue. How you get to the conclusion about any issue is the issue. And when you show up with biases without asking more questions, when you show up with a belief system that is so absolute without being wise, like should we put a couple in front of 300 people and destroy them? And tell them we're being biblical. And so there's much to it. Number 4, and then I'll just read these quick. Balance, self-fulfillment, and common good. It's very dangerous, unhealthy when you put people only before yourself. When it's all about people and you never pay, that's extremely unhealthy. When you only think of yourself and don't think of other people, extremely unhealthy. People who are wise go, there's paying attention to my own self-fulfillment, but people are important, and it's a balance. Number 5, question the status quo. That's what I loved about yesterday. Question the status quo, and we are going to be a church that honors more questions then gives answers. And then number 6, focus on meaning, significance, and purpose. And I wish I could have told, but Jesus takes this woman through all of these things. And so we are going to be a loving church. We are going to be a feeling church. We are going to be an enigmatic church. What does that mean? We embrace mystery. We live with uncertainty. And we are going to be a thinking church. We are going to pay attention to what's going on the deck, but we are going to honor that hole in the side. And when people are saying, I can't pick a religion that is going to sacrifice my mind in this new millennium, I happen to believe that Christianity is done. It will go the way of Europe. And if we continue to go, boy, people are just getting more secular and walking away from God, we are not doing the right amount of self-evaluation. I believe the smarter and the wiser I get, the more spiritual and devoted I can be. I believe that with all of my heart, and I hope you'll consider that. Let's pray. Father, may we love you with all of our minds. Period. In Jesus' name.